The books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now we're moving into the book of Esther tonight. Now, as we begin to think about the book of Esther, as we're looking at it as the third book, but it actually is not chronologically correct. Really, the book of Esther appears before the events that we find in the book of Nehemiah. And really, that ought to stress to us the importance of looking at it that way, chronologically, because without the events of Esther, and really, I believe the providence of God at work and the events that are described there, we wouldn't have the events of Nehemiah. And so we're going to look at this book, which is just a fascinating book in both the way it is written, instructed, as well as the story it contains. So as we kind of begin tonight's going to largely be an introduction and kind of look at some overview. But I don't know if you've thought about this, but the book of Esther solicits some very extreme reactions. We think about certain books in the Bible and we think about how we have very polarizing responses to the book. You can think about in the New Testament, like a lot of people have extreme reactions to the book of James. But I don't know if you've thought about it very much, but Esther is that kind of book for many people. The fact of the matter is from a Jewish perspective, it is one of 5 books in the Old Testament that is typically written on a single scroll because it is used in Jewish festivals. And out of those 5 books, most ancient Jews believed Esther was the greatest. There was a Jew who wrote in about 1200 BC. He said outside of the Torah, the greatest book in the Old Testament was Esther. And he said, if all of the Old Testament passed away, all that would remain is the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books, and Esther itself. But you go to the opposite extreme. And I'm used these 2 names, John Calvin and Martin Luther, not because they have any particular authority or the fact is they're more learned than anyone else, but they represent this polar extreme reaction. John Calvin refused to preach from the book of Esther. He said because it is nothing but human ingenuity and vengeance, that the New Testament writers do not quote from it. The fact of the matter is he goes so far as not to include it in any of his commentaries of the Old Testament. Martin Luther, when he looked at the book of Esther, he said he wished it did not even exist because there is too much Judaism and too much pagan rubbish, is the way he described it. Polar extremes from this one little book in the New Testament. The Old Testament. But I'll tell you that those extreme reactions are not confined to those bigger pictures. A lot of people who study this book as Christians have polar reactions. Some people go to one extreme and they idolize Mordecai and Esther, and everything they do is just some heroic act, while others go to the other extreme and they vilify their actions. Both extreme reactions to the events in the book. And the fact of the matter is it's probably somewhere in between. We've got to remember, when we read biblical narrative or history through the Bible doesn't always record for us what people should do and what should have happened, but what actually did happen and what they did do. Because as you read the book of Esther as it begins, you think about the things where it just exhibited maybe a level of faithlessness at the beginning. The fact of the matter is Mordecai and Esther were not with the first group who returned to Jerusalem. They decided to remain behind in Persia. A number of different times they tried to hide their identity. They wouldn't recognize or claim themselves to be the people of God. At the onset, Esther seemed more concerned about her life than the lives of the people. And the fact that Mordecai wouldn't even bow down to Haman, even though it probably wasn't deserved, he put his entire race at risk. But Esther and Mordecai seemed to grow through the book, and their faith seemed to increase. And by the time we get to the end of the book, Esther is acting much more courageously. And so we have this growth maybe that occurs. So maybe it's both. But I just want you to know that Esther just kind of solicits those extreme reactions. And so what we want to do tonight is just kind of give kind of an overview, kind of look at some big picture ideas about this book of Esther, because I'll just tell you, I think the book of Esther is fascinating. Thus, the way that it's structured, the story it tells, I think has a lot of meat for us to consider. But as we start, we want to just kind of look at the historical context that we've already talked about. The book of Esther really falls between the 6th and the 7th chapter in the book of Ezra. So as in the book of Ezra, the first 6 chapters record the first return of the people from the land of Persia. We remember kind of a lead up to the history, how God sent the people into captivity because of their profaneness and the rebellion against him. How he initially sent the Assyrians to take the 10 northern tribes into captivity and then Babylon. How the Medo-Persian was the next great world empire, conquering all the rest. And God said he would raise up a shepherd, and he named that shepherd by name in Isaiah, Cyrus. And Cyrus allowed the people to return to their home and actually supplied with them treasure. So the first 6 chapters in Ezra talk about this first return. But between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Ezra, there is a time span of roughly 58 to 60 years. It's a gap in the history. And Esther and the events of Esther occur right in that time frame. After that, we have chapter 7 through 10 that records the second return, then another 13-year gap, and then the events of Nehemiah. So Esther kind of occurs right in the midst of the 2 books that we've kind of already looked at or precedes them. The book of Esther itself gives us lots of time stamps, lots of information and dates that we can track the events that occur through the book of Esther. Really, I just want to kind of highlight the years here because we can kind of track them. The events of Esther take place in roughly a decade. That's it, about 10 years. So even though there's a 60-year gap roughly between chapter 6 and chapter 7, the events of Esther is only 10 years, only about 10 years long. And we're going to kind of see that or see some of those as we kind of walk through the book together. Now, the book of Esther is probably the only book that's dedicated to the life and the difficulties and the challenges of the diaspora, those who have been scattered abroad. It's focusing in on their lives and their challenges. Other books talk about it, but this is all about the people who have remained in the land and the challenges that they're going to face. And so that's what we're going to be looking at when we look at the book of Esther. Now, kind of on the world scene, what's going on in the world? We're going to focus on the Jews. Well, you know what's happening in the world? The Persian leader is trying to take over the Greek city-states. I mean, you have the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis. On the world stage, a guy named Confucius, he dies about this time. That's kind of what's going on in the world, but we're going to focus in on one specific geographical place and one group of people and what is going on in their lives. That's what's going to happen in the book of Esther. Now, as I mentioned, it's going to be in one geographical place. That's where the primary focus, and that is the city of Susa, or depending on your translation, Shushan, okay? And that is one of the 4 capital cities of the Persian Empire. It's about 150 miles north of the Gulf. It is in southwest modern-day Iran. That's where the ancient city of Susa existed and where still a city exists by that name. But as I said, it's one of 4 capital cities, along with Ecbatana, Babylon, and sometimes people call it Persepolis or Paragadai is the other capital city of the Persian Empire. The city of Susa became the winter capital. So when winter came along, the Persian court relocated and established themselves in the city of Susa. And the city of Susa was basically a fortified town, a citadel. And a town grew up, all the officials lived within the town, and the town grew up around it. But it's primarily focused on the citadel or the military fortress. Now, In Esther, that's really not the first time we've heard this city. You remember back in Daniel chapter 8, roughly 80 years earlier, Daniel was in the city of Susa, and he gave that great prophecy. You remember the goat and all the animal-like qualities that he mentions. That's also in the city of Susa, but that's where everything, at least the principal characters, are going to be located, is in this city. Now, I want to just take for just a few minutes and just kind of walk through the characters that we're going to find in this story. And there are really, depending on how you count them, we're going to either 5 or 6 main characters, but the main character, as I think you all know, is not even mentioned by name, okay? But we're going to look at the characters that I mentioned and then make reference to the one that was unnamed. The first one we're going to look at is known as the Persian King, who the text calls Ahasuerus. Now, that would most new is in the Greek, it would be Xerxes the First. He was given the nickname or the name Longmanus, which the Greeks, who were his enemies, said he had big hands, but really the Persians said that it talked about the extent of his rule. It stretched from border to border. He assumed the throne at roughly 41 years of age, and I don't know if this is PR, propaganda. It said he was the fairest man of his age and a fair prince and full of integrity. Well, that's not how the book of Esther presents him. The fact of the matter is the book of Esther presents this man often given over to drink and making poor decisions because of it, and seeming to be he seems somewhat simple and even forgetful in the story of Esther. But that's how other secular sources look at him. From the text itself, there's a couple of things that we'll just kind of point out. Look at chapter 1 and verse 1. It talks about the extent of his holdings or his kingdom in verse 1 of the book of Esther, chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces." From India to Ethiopia. But the fact is he wanted his nation to be bigger. And most of his reign was taken up with trying to conquer the Greek city-states. And most believe that great feast that we read of in chapter 1, that banquet, was really a war council, a council about how they're going to set forth and conquer the Greek people. That comes from a Greek historian by the name of Herodotus, and that's what he prescribes this feast to. And there's a gap even in the story here. So if you look at chapter 1, verse 3, it notes it's Ahasuerus' 3rd year. But if you look at chapter 2 and verse 16, it moves to his 7th year. So there's a 4-year gap from the beginning of chapter 1 to chapter 2. And that's about the length of the time that he tried to invade Greece. So we just see something about the king who's going to be part of this story. The picture on the screen, it's no pyramid, but that's actually ascribed as the tomb of Xerxes the First. Still a pretty good edifice, a monument that we see there. It's just north of Persepolis, there in the nation of Persia. That's the first character. The second character we'll look at is his queen, Queen Vashti, or Vashti. She kind of appears on the scene and disappears pretty quick as far as the story goes. But she seems to be a very strong-willed individual who would not give in to the drunken request of her husband. And so she fades from the scene very quickly. Other historical sources may mean that her name in other sources is a mistress. So if you run across that in your historical readings. So we have Ahasuerus or Xerxes the First and his original queen Vashti. Then we have Mordecai. Mordecai, just some facts from the story, some things that we get. He seems to be a minor court official at the onset of the story, or a functionary. And the reason I suggest that is because, do you see how easily he kind of he traverses the hallways of the king? He goes into even the harem to talk to Esther. You find him at the king's gate. where he finds or discovers the plot. So at the very early stages, it doesn't ever state that, but it seems like he is some type of functionary in the Persian government. Another thing the text notes, he is a Benjamite in chapter 2 and verse 5. And we'll come back to this in just a minute because this might play just a little bit of role. It says, now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shammai, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Ultimately, because he discovered this plot against the king. He was known as the king's friend, and ultimately he assumes the role that Haman once occupied as sort of the prime minister of the Persian Empire at this point. His name, most likely, is a transliteration of the Babylonian god Marduk. You go, what? Well, just remember in Daniel, right? All the Hebrew youths, at least we have record of, were given Babylonian names. You know, Daniel, Belshazzar, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Mordecai very likely was given a Persian name to reflect some allegiance to one of their pagan gods. So that's what we know about, at least something about Mordecai. We know he cared for Esther. We see some degree of loyalty to the king as he exposes the plot as he performed in the city. And there was a great deal of antagonism that existed between him and Haman. Next character, Esther. Probably the character by name that we know about. She was a Jewish orphan who was basically raised by her cousin Mordecai. And apparently she was extremely beautiful. Enough so that she could win a beauty contest and aspire to the rank of queen. Her name, there's some difference of opinion there. Some believe it comes from the Persian word for star, or others believe it may have derived from the goddess Ishtar. But that's where her name comes, the name Esther may come from. But we're given in the text in chapter 2 and verse 7, isn't it? That her Hebrew name is Hadassah. That is translated as myrtle tree. There may be some significance to that. Myrtle trees kind of originated in Babylon, and people transplanted them when they returned back to the land. And so in passages like Zechariah chapter 1, you got those horses and they're standing among the myrtle trees. Well, it became a picture for Jews who had been transplanted from captivity back to their homeland. So there may be some allusion to that in her name. She's one of two women books of the Bible who are named after women. She and the Moabitess Ruth, who became the wife of Boaz, they are the only two books in the Bible that are named after women. And they bear a great deal of similarity. Both books are about saving their people to some degree. Ruth saves the people through the lineage of Jesus Christ. Esther saves the people by her efforts to have Haman deposed and killed and changing the king's mind. But both are about saving their people in some degree, about looking forward to that. So, Ahasuerus, Vashti, Mordecai, Esther. Then we load to the villain, and that is Haman. And really the main thing that we're going to note about Haman, besides his arrogance and his willingness to grow drunk and make foolish decisions and also make rash decisions and hasty decisions, is he's simply an Agagite. That's what the text specifically notes. If you look in chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. And that became, I think there's a motif, a theme. We'll look at that in just a minute, and that's going to play a role. We know that Haman set about to both destroy Mordecai and then ultimately all the Jews. He was going to have Mordecai impaled as the typical form of crucifixion at that time, but he himself was killed on the instrument of his own devising. Now, two other characters in this. One are the people themselves, the Jews themselves. At this time, most records say that living in Persian captivity, there were 2 to 3 million Jews. That's probably the most consistent set of numbers that you'll arrive. So living in Persia at this time is some 2 to 3 million Jews. And their lives are basically going to be on the line here in this book. And this book emphasizes that. The word Jew is found over 53 different times in the book of Esther. Now, the word Jew derives from the name Judah, but it comes to stand for all the people of God, all of the nations. And here kind of begins that transition. 53 times in this book, it becomes the focus of the text. And then the final character is the one that's unmentioned, but who I believe is all over the pages of this book. The primary character, the hero, and that's God himself. Most people know, and I think everyone here probably knows, that maybe the most unique feature about the book of Esther is that God, prayer, sacrifice, the law is not mentioned anywhere explicitly in the book. And we're going to look at that just a little bit further. So, any thoughts so far? I'm going to jump in. Any ideas on the characters? Anything that stands out that you want to throw in before we kind of move on with some different ideas? Okay. So we're going to look at and this may not be the best order, but this is the way I've got it right now. We're going to kind of look at the purpose of this book. And I'm going to suggest 3 to you. There may be more. But first of all, I want you to look at this book as you read this story and realize that God's care and deliverance is not limited. And what I mean by that is it's not limited by the confines of Palestine. The fact is God can deliver even out of Persia. And it is not limited by the moral ambiguity of the people that he uses to accomplish his purposes. As I kind of mentioned, I believe at the beginning of the book, Esther and Mordecai are not wholly committed in service to the Lord, but the Lord could still use them to accomplish his purposes, and at the same time, if they allow it, transform their character into what he would want them to be. God in any way is not limited. The second purpose I think this book kind of points to, and I'll say this, it's kind of shown through kind of a weird thing that goes on in the book, the casting of the lot, or the pure. And first of all, that's just something we don't do, but apparently even in their ancient cultures, this is a picture of an Assyrian pur, or a dye, that's got cuneiform on it, basically, that they cast and try to determine the outcome or the direction they should go. We see Haman casting the pur. He's trying to cast the die to try to make a decision. At the end of the book, we have the Feast of Purim, and what it really says is that the children of God, those who place their confidence in God, their trust in God, do not have to cast the die. It's not up to chance. It's not up to fortune. It is in the hands of a God who acts on their behalf and cares for them. God's control and power is not limited. The second one, it's kind of an etiology explaining the origin of the Feast of Purim. Because really this whole book kind of gets to the end and says, why are they celebrating this feast? And it's an explanation of this feast and how it came about. And ultimately, it's just showing people of all ages how they can learn to depend upon God even when his actions are not explicitly seen. And I think that's why this book in some ways is so relevant for us. I know God is acting. I can't see how God is acting today. I don't know the course he's taken from day to day, but I trust that he is. And books like Esther confirm that over and over again. We may not be able to see it with our eyes or perceive it with our ears, but through the eyes of faith, we know and can see that God acts. And so in some ways, the book of Esther is much more applicable to our situation and our life at this time. So, what's some key passages in the book that I want to look at? I'm going to look at basically 4 with you. Probably the one everybody chooses is Esther chapter 4, verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? Now, I'll tell you that verse and its implications are, in its context, is kind of a difficult verse to look at. But the thing I think I want us to focus on most is this is one of those verses that points to the providence of God. That God has acted in human affairs to such a degree that raised someone up that they might act to bring about his will. It's a verse that points to God's dealings in human affairs. It points to the providence of God. Second passage, Esther chapter 8 and verse 17. In each and every province and each and every city, whether the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land become Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. We see in this text how or why God acts in the providential way. First of all, he exercises care and deliverance over those who are his, bring gladness of heart and joy. But the result of his providential care for his people brings dread on others that causes them to then turn and become Jews. It causes his mighty workings and saving of his people brought people up short and said, I need to be following this God, the only true and living God. His actions, in a sense, were just acting in a way that would draw people to himself, cause dread to fall on. And the final one is the one we kind of looked at, chapter 9, verse 26. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the name of the Pur, and because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to him, the origin of this feast and why they were celebrating it. So that's 3 texts that I think are kind of key to the story as it moves forward. But I think if you wanted to highlight a key chapter, it's chapter 6. Everything turns at chapter 6. I'm not a big supporter of chiasms. People talk about these structures that exist because I think they're kind of hard to prove. But if you look at the story of Esther, it is an exact parallel to get to chapter 6, and chapter 6 is the turning point of this story. It is the reversal of all reversals. It is where Mordecai is led through the streets by Haman on the back of a horse, how those who were going to be cast down were raised up. Mordecai becomes, it's the great reversal in this text. So if there's just one chapter, it's chapter 6. So, just some key passages to think about. I want to spend the time we've got remaining looking at some literary characteristics of this text. Somebody wrote it this way. He says, to say that the story of Esther is well told is an understatement. It is by any standards a brilliantly written story to be savored, even chuckled over. And I want you to think about that a little bit. So I believe the book of Esther is history. It's true events, and I think the Bible presents it as such. But at the same time, it's also a literary work. It is put together in such a way to emphasize certain themes and motives, and we do well to kind of pay attention to those things. So what's some characteristics of Esther? Well, one of the big characteristics, it's got lots of irony. I mean, you read through this book, and what you think's going to happen doesn't happen. There's reversal after reversal. I mean, Haman, who sets about to kill Mordecai, is then impaled on the stake that he was going to kill Mordecai. I mean, it's irony. I mean, the ironic beginning. I mean, Ahasuerus brings Vashti and says, you're going to come and appear and show your beauty to the council. She refuses. He deposes her. Then he makes a law and says, women got to stay, men are the masters of their women. I mean, she got basically what she wanted. It's kind of an upside down kind of story. We see that throughout. And the reason I think that's such a powerful motive, it sticks in our minds, but it also is how God acts. I mean, when we look at the world and circumstances, when we weigh the odds, when we determine the course of action, God is not bound and limited by those things. I mean, he can cause things to happen that just upset the apple cart, and that's why it becomes such a mighty characteristic of this story, and an indication that God is involved in this. I mean, just think about this for just a minute. How many orphans do you know that eventually arise to become queen? How many people who are basically a nameless functionary in the government who performs a deed of loyalty by uncovering a plot is forgotten, but then ultimately rises to be second in the kingdom? How many times do we know that outside of the Bible, let's just say, because we have some allusions to the story of Joseph. That's where these ironies come into play. God does the unexpected. And it's only ironic from the perspective of the world, based on common everyday experience. Hey, Mike. Oh, sorry, you're over there. Now, we mentioned that there's no mention of God, the Mosaic Law, or prayer in this book. But we say that, and I don't know. Oh, it says it's got a good battery. Let's see if that did it. But contrast to that, the king, the word king, is found over 100 times, and Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, is mentioned by name specifically 30 times. So all the focus seems to be on the leader of the Persian Empire, but in contrast, God, the creator of the universe, is not mentioned at all. But even though he's not mentioned, his fingerprints are kind of all over the story. G. Campbell Morgan said it that way. He says, while there's no name of God and no mention of the Hebrew religion anywhere, no one reads this book without being conscious of God. And you see it from one incident to the next. And the question may be that we want to kind of ask ourselves is why God decided to include this book that doesn't mention his name at all. Why? And I'll just offer a few just ideas. First of all, it adds to the irony, right? Who's in control in this book? Well, the king is. He's mentioned the most, right? The emperor of the Persian Empire. No, God is. Because what God wills to happen, happens. Another suggestion is, it says the writer, the narrator may have chosen this method to emphasize the hidden nature of divine providence. And doing so kind of invites people to look at the affairs of everyday life to see how God is involved. I mean, because that's what we got to do, right? I mean, we pray for things to happen. They happen. Do we see God involved in that? Do we, with the eyes of faith? Do we believe that God is active today? I surely hope we do, in seeing how he is. Maybe it's because most of the participants chose not to return and to a certain degree decided to remain anonymous. Like Mordecai and Esther didn't want to be named as Jews at the onset. Maybe God chose to be anonymous. And maybe this last one. By admitting the reference to God emphasizes that God's care does not relieve people of the responsibility to act. And so maybe we think about this idea, this story this way. We hope that God just sends a mighty prophet or an angel and he's going to do this explicitly. But the fact of the matter is, even if he doesn't do that, it doesn't relieve us of our responsibility to act godly and do what we can for his kingdom and his cause and his people. Even though he's not mentioned, it does not cease people to acting. Now, yeah. Yeah. So Boyd mentions J.W. McGarvey. He said the readers are left to discover the workings of God for themselves, right? And that kind of gets back to that one invitation to see for ourselves where God is involved. Good point, Boyd. Matt?
One other thing I heard is that it was written without the reference to God because the primary audience to read it in the Persian Empire were going to be heathen.
Yeah.
And they would have rejected it or would never have been transferred or handed around.
That's an interesting thought as well. So just so God's name would not be solely on the lips of people who would not appreciate it, maybe the idea, the primary readers. That's an interesting thought as well. So good thoughts. Anybody else before we... The next couple are just kind of odd, and I'm just going to tell you, I kind of nerd out over this stuff. I really like it, and sometimes I can't explain the significance, but they're undeniable. Every major event in the book of Esther occurs at a feast or an association with a feast. I mean, everything in the book of Esther is tied to a festival, a party, or a feast day. It begins with a feast where the drunken revelry is kind of going on, and Vashtai is ordered to come before the governing officials of the land, and it ends with the Feast of Purim. Now, what to make of that, I don't know. I have one suggestion for you, though. The fact of the matter is, we have a saying that he who laughs last laughs best, kind of that statement. It begins with a pagan leader trying to accomplish his will in very ungodly and immoral ways. And it ends with God being triumphant and his people being triumphant over their enemies. In Psalm 23 and verse 5, you remember he says, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies." That's exactly what God does through the midst of these feasts in Esther. Before their enemies, he prepares this table and casts them down. They're all associated with feasts. Another kind of odd thing about the book, the writer of the book sets everything up in pairs. I mean, 2 different times Esther denies her place as a Jew. The parties are set in groups of 2. There's 2 different lists of the servants. It's just 2s all the way through it. And that probably sets up the irony in the text, but it's just kind of something to note about the book. So, we're about out of time, but I wanted to get to this and try to quickly go through this. Even though God's not mentioned in this book, you cannot read this book apart from the great stories of the Bible. We often talk about foreshadows and types. I don't think these are foreshadows and types. I think these are motives. The story of the Bible is told in similar stories over and over again till it gets to the grandest story. And here in the book of Esther, even though God himself is not mentioned, stories where God is the principal character are shown. I mean, you read the book of Esther, you can't help but see the Exodus, right? They're in a foreign court, they're in danger, and there's deliverance, and it ends with a feast, Passover and Purim. Or you look at the Joseph story, how an individual rises to prominence and saves God's people. You have these stories that occur. But I want to just point to 2 comparisons real quick. We referenced this earlier. It's kind of hard. It seems almost an intentional action of the writer of this story to make a comparison between Mordecai and Saul. Remember, Mordecai is a Benjamite. His enemy, Haman, is an Agagite. What tribe's from Saul? He's a Benjamite, right? Who is his enemy? And in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Okay? You see this idea that there's a holy war going on. Saul failed to uphold the standard of God, and the question is Mordecai going to defeat the Amalekites, or is he going to give in? And that kind of sets up some tension in the book. Another kind of comparison, obvious one, right? Esther and Daniel, both individuals in foreign courts, and the question is, at least as the story sets up, you remember when Daniel went in? He had made up his mind not to defile himself with the king's bounty or table, right? Do we see that with Esther? No. She ate and made merry. And the question is she going to reverse herself and become like Daniel or not? So you have this comparison and contrast even with Esther and Daniel. This writer puts it this way. He says, the author of Esther employs many conventions, themes, motives, and terms borrowed from other stories in the Hebrew Bible. Esther is a thoroughly biblical book in this sense. In its intertextuality, it provides an interbiblical dialogue, making allusion to other heroes and incidents throughout. The naming of God in these other stories makes his presence all the more implicit in Esther. The only thing I would strike from there, he didn't borrow from these other stories. He was inspired, or this person was inspired, and they used similar stories to move forward. Quickly, what about Esther for today? What's some value? I'm going to give you three as we kind of move through this study. First of all, Esther is a book about growing in faith. I don't believe Esther started off well. But by the end, she was willing to put her life on the line for the sake of her people. She grew in faith and confidence in God. We all need that lesson. Secondly, I think this book shows us how we are to act and react to the providence or the actions of God. It's about trusting that God is acting, but even though knowing that God is acting, placing the responsibility on myself to do what I can for the sake of the kingdom and the sake of others. Trusting in God, but moving forward and doing that He will bless the efforts that we engage in. And finally, it's a story about living a godly life in a pagan world. That's what the story of Esther ultimately is about. And I think all three of those are lessons that we can learn from this story together. Out of time, I didn't think we'd get through it. Anybody got any comments before we get there? Lord willing, next Wednesday we're going to look at the text, but I want to spend just a little time at the first talking about the ideas of providence, the providence of God, and then we'll jump into the story itself. So, come on.